Now tonight is the first Thursday of the month, and so the cycle of programs that we go through, this is more of a night that's on a Dharma talk, and Dharma meaning practice. And how do we engage in practice? And last week I was talking more about attention and wakefulness, and especially as related to some of the teachings from the Dhammapada, the sayings of the Buddha, and the Heart Sutra that we did last week as a practice. Because attention is foundational. It's a foundational aspect of what the practices are aimed at. And it is really the focus of also now a lot of the research that's being done on meditative practices. Because just as we focus here on practices, breath, mantra, meditation, various ways of approaching meditation for knowing the infinite, for knowing the ground of our being, for knowing the divine within, the many ways that we can refer to that wide open spaciousness of awareness. But there are practical outcomes that come through the practices, and now there's a lot of research that really shows that. I remember 30 years ago when I was trying to teach meditation and talk about some of the research, there was only very little. Now there are literally thousands of research studies done a year on meditation and showing the many different ways it impacts our mind and our body and our brain. Now, of course, science is a materialist philosophy approach, so it's looking at material events. In other words, what's happening in the brain, what neurons are firing, what are the measurables that we can look at. And so it helps to discern that level of what's going on. It's not going to get into what's the broad expanse of unity consciousness. It can see how that might be reflected or impacting the body and the brain, but it can't actually enter that domain. Our instruments of science and research are limited to the physical domain, whereas our experience includes all of what we can be conscious of. And that goes way beyond that. But when we look at the research, a lot of the research has been especially aimed at mindfulness research. And mindfulness is a set of practices really that goes back thousands of years. The yogis were doing mindfulness as a foundational practice of meditation for thousands of years before Buddha came along. Buddha was first trained in yoga and really took mindfulness as a foundational practice for being able to enter the domain of awareness that he unfolded, that he just called Buddha. Buddha means awake. Awake to what? Awake to what's beyond the mind. But it takes being able to train along the way what's happening to that mind. What is our attention going to? Because as we think, so we become. So if our attention is wandering here and there and all over the place, then we don't have it stabilized. We don't have it grounded. We can't focus it sufficiently in order to do this kind of extraordinary task that really the yogis and the Buddha masters were really directing their attention at achieving. Now, along the way, of course, because they're developing attention, it shows up that, without having attained, nirvana, enlightenment, transcendent states, anything like that, there are a lot of positive outcomes that come just from working our attention. Because attention is a set of faculties that we make use of that we can see in neurophysiological research that there are different attentional networks that are worked in different ways as we do meditative practices. And so for these practices, even as something as simple as mindfulness of breath. Now mindfulness as a practice is a way of engaging a non-judgmental just awareness, and if it's, say, the focus is the breath, then you're just bringing the mind back to the breath over and over again. We combine it with mantra. So mantra and breath. Mantra is another focusing technique, though there's a lot more to mantra than just the mechanics of repeating it. we see that mantra and mantra with breath are engaging various circuits in the brain and strengthening them. And now the research over the last really decades now, and more recently, have shown the profound impact that just these simple practices, bringing the mind back to the breath, back to mantra. Because each time you do that, you're letting go of some other thought, some other feeling, some other sensation, some other distraction, to bring it back to your chosen object of focus, the breath and the mantra. By doing that, you're transforming the neurophysiology of attention, and now research shows it even is literally changing the structure of the brain. So first, when we were first looking and research was first coming out about meditation, it was showing sort of the transient effects, things that were happening in the moment. Changes in breath rate, changes in heart rate, changes in skin conductance, changes related to autonomic nervous system functioning. And then as research progressed, it started to show, well, no, there are changes in EEG, there are changes in what hemisphere might be dominant in certain activities. So the output of the brain and the areas of the output of the brain were being measured and seen to change with meditative practices. Those are all still transient phenomena. It wasn't until we got further along in research that it started to show that, oh no, there are actual structural changes that are happening in the brain, that there are areas of the brain related to networks of attention where that area of the brain and the cortex thickens. So it's literally changing the structure, increasing those, the thickness of the cortex in those areas, reflecting that strengthening of attentional capacities. And one of the interesting pieces of research came out a few years ago showed that, in fact, it reversed the aging process in the brain related to attention in those areas, because with age, the cortex thins. We lose neurons. And yet, older meditators who had been meditating for longer than younger meditators actually had thicker cortexes in those areas of attention than newer, younger meditators. So literally, this kind of practice can help reverse or prevent some of the decline in what goes on in our brain related to attention, focused attention, encoding of memory, etc. So a lot of these are really very beneficial outcomes for what's going on through meditative practices. And that's why meditation, mindfulness, has been applied to so many different things. I mean, people come to me in my professional practice interested in learning mindfulness, meditative practices, doing biofeedback, a way of using technology to develop these self-regulation skills. For everything from peak performance to dealing with anxiety, many different applications from many different professions, all enhanced by a meditative practice. And it reminds me of when I was early on, back in the 70s, studying with Swami Muktananda. He used to tell people, meditation makes doctors a better doctor. It makes plumbers better plumbers. It makes electricians better electricians. It makes mothers better mothers, dads better dads. Meditation's good for everybody. And we'd all go, yeah, we see that, but why? Well, because it's helping to transform our mind and our attention, and moment by moment, what we are able to bring our skill and bring into the world is a reflection of how stable, how developed is our attention. So attention, 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 that's what it keeps coming back to. And so research is helping to refine that. There are studies showing that in different ways mindfulness will affect different areas. Now we know that in a sense, there are circuits in the brain. And there's one related to alerting. And so there's circuitry in the brain that has to do with how are we prepared to respond. And then there's an orienting circuit in the brain that helps our attention orient towards, well, what's the salient stimulus? What do we actually need to pay attention to? And then there's an executive component to attention that helps us sort out, oh no, this is in conflict, we go with this one, not the other one. And all of those are being worked and developed even when you're doing something as simple as sitting quietly, simply breathing, slowing and deepening your breath, allowing your attention to rest on the breath, silently repeating the mantra. Later on we'll be doing the mantra Om Namah Shivaya and the mantra Om Kali Ma, ancient mantras, that then help the mind get into that state of more focused, relaxed attentiveness. And that then begins to produce these changes. Now, another interesting thing that's come out of the research recently is, we would see in research showing that, well, weeks of practice, months of practice, even years and decades of practice would produce these profound changes. But what about briefer practices? What about shorter practices? And so now it's showing that even brief practices have an immediate effect after the meditation is over. Sustained effects, that still comes with repeated practice done over time. But something as short as a 10-minute breath meditation, mindfulness meditation, begins to show that these circuits are enhanced compared to a control group that didn't do such a practice. So when they do tests of attention to match groups, and one group did a 10-minute mindfulness meditation, the other just sat there, the mindfulness meditative group, their circuitry, even though they were novice, they were brand new to meditation, their circuitry changed in a positive way. So that's great for meditators to know that, we don't have to do this forever and ever and finally we'll get a result. No, every time you sit, every time you bring your attention back, you're training it. And the way the brain works, it's like training anything else. The more frequently you train, the longer you train, the more profound the effects, the more long-lasting the effects. And then these translate into making us better moms and dads, spouses, citizens of our culture, that we can bring the root qualities then that the mystics talked about our boundless compassion, our boundless loving nature, our boundless kindness, our boundless patience. Then we can walk those into the world when our mind isn't being flipped around by one thing after another, so we don't have the steadiness that it takes to be able to do that. So these practices are both transforming the mind, transforming our circuitry, transforming neuronal connections. They're having impact on our autonomic nervous system. They change immune function. So all of these very positive results then get translated into our everyday life and the transformation we can see in how we go about doing things. Another area that's come out that's also been demonstrating the power of meditation is, we often think of, well, meditation's, that's nice, you're just sitting there, it's a calm environment, maybe you're at home right now and it's nice and quiet or whatever might be going on. What happens when you need to be using it or engaging it in the face of something that's demanding attention, like pain? So pain management has been another area of research that has further showed the power of meditation. Because the experience of pain is a complex phenomenon. It's not just like, you've got an injury and it creates pain. There's a lot that goes on in the brain in terms of processing the signal and how we react to that sensory experience of pain that can either exacerbate it, make it worse, or dampen it down, make it less, make us less reactive. And it turns out that as they've studied meditators and watch what goes on in their brain relation to pain, it does change. It changes the brain and how it responds to that. So even in the face of really large stimulus, pain, still the power of meditation is present to help a person move through that. Right? So the power of meditation is nothing just subtle. It's not just, oh, I sat and I did mantras and it got airy and isn't that sweet? Not that that all can't happen. But we can see it translates into very concrete outcomes that really do improve life. And what Buddha and yogis were talking about reduces suffering. It reduces suffering. Right? And other studies that have been done on meditation, and for instance, meditation and looking at what happens when people who have uncontrolled epilepsy, seizure disorders. Now, a seizure is not a subtle phenomenon. It's like an electrical storm in part of the brain. And it was found that people who were taught meditation, they reduced the frequency, the duration, and the intensity of seizure disorders. So again, pointing to that power of meditation to help the mind and the brain self-regulate in ways that we didn't know really were even possible. But all of this is tied up in doing, again, something as simple as slowing and deepening the breath, keeping your mind coming back to that, letting go of this distraction, that distraction, a thought, a sensation, and a memory, something about the future. Just let it go, let it go, let it go. Come back to the breath, come back to the mantra, over and over and over. And doing that is having a profound impact on what's going on in the mind and the body. And deconditioning many patterns of conditioned reactivity. Right? Because a lot of how our mind reacts is a function of how it learned and was conditioned to respond over our whole life. Some of those are maladaptive. Some of them really don't work. So being able to undo that kind of conditioning process in such a gentle and compassionate way produces these profound, really sometimes life-saving effects. So the power of meditation and the power of attention is critical for doing what the intent behind Buddha's dissemination of these practices, the yogis, for realizing the highest, because what gets in the way? What distracts us from knowing what's already present? Well, there's a couple of things. Another thing that came out of the research on yogis and Zen masters and Buddhist masters is a phenomenon called the habituation response. The habituation response was thought to be hardwired, like many of these other things related to the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means automatic. Clearly not so, since we can intervene on them and change them. But the habituation response is the response that, you have a shirt on, you don't notice it after a while. You wear a watch or a ring, you don't notice it after a while. The brain, in an attempt to conserve its attentional resources, says something that's continuously present, non-threatening, it doesn't have to attend to, and so it just goes blank on that. We don't hear the ticking of the clock, we don't hear a dripping faucet after a while, or if we do, we get annoyed because the habituation response, it's supposed to work, why isn't it? But that response was interesting because it was showing up in some of the brain studies on yogis and Zen masters that they could kind of shut that on or off. And so that they could shut it off and repeated stimuli they didn't habituate to, or you could have stimuli and they'd be aware of it and it didn't show any reactivity in their EEG. So that's an interesting phenomenon that really sort of passed under the radar when that first came out in the late 50s, early 60s in the research. But it's critical to understand what the real intent of Buddhist and yogic practices. Because their intent behind all what we do here through Anam, Cara and many other traditions is to know the living presence of the infinite. Call it divine, call it God, call it goddess, call it whatever you'd like. This living presence that's always there, always loving, always kind, always embracing. So what is it? It's not threatening. So if you have a mechanism in your brain that takes phenomenon that are constantly present and non-threatening, and shuts them out because it's more interested in what might be moving, because that might be something you have to run from, run after, eat, survive, fight. That was what that orienting reflex was all aimed at: conserve resources for preservation of life and limb. That mechanism then is also filtering out the awareness of what's always present, the living presence of the infinite. And across all spiritual and Buddhist, yogic, whatever traditions, religious traditions of the West, the fundamental qualities of the divine are it's always present, always loving, always embracing, always there. So we have to be able to sort of pass through that gate of habituation and have a mind that remains aware, present, awake for the subtleties of the experience of that presence. And not chase after every distraction. Oh, that thought, that was an interesting one. Oh, that memory, well, do I have to do something with that? Oh, I got the to-do list for tomorrow. I got to attend to that. If the mind's doing all that, it's not going to experience the fullness of that presence, the awareness of your own divine nature, the divine nature of all that is. So we have to pass through that doorway. And that's part of what repeated practice helps to stabilize our attentional capacities so that we can stay with something as subtle. A lot of people will say, meditation is boring. You're just going to watch the breath? That is the novelty-seeking mind complaining. Because part of what we're conditioned to do, our mind is conditioned to do, is to seek novelty, to seek stimulus. We have to set that aside to unfold the very ground of our being, the very infinitude of who and what we are, and what all are. So that's why, it's not that, the yogis couldn't think of exciting things to do. It's not about promoting and cultivating a mind that's addicted to stimulus. It's about get subtler and subtler, get more and more refined. So mantra as a practice, we can chant it out loud. That's one level. Then we start to silently repeat it. Now that's a subtler level, more powerful, demanding that we stay attentive to something quieter. Then we go deeper and deeper with that until we start to hear just the mantra, in a sense, repeating itself. That's an even quieter state, an even subtler, even more powerful level of consciousness. Then mantra itself begins to dissolve its form. Om Namah Shivaya begins to just be a throb of awareness, the awareness of being, the awareness of I am. I am that. I am all that is. Not in those words. The words are pointing at it. The experience is the experience of that awareness. And that's what the practices are drawing us into. Get quieter, get subtler, get more powerful, get more direct into being able to surrender and let go completely of the ordinary mind and its cravings for all kinds of stimulus, and settle into the magnificent presence of pure being, the infinite, the divine. It's beyond anything the mind can imagine. It's more enticing than anything the mind has ever known, ever experienced. But it's just the other side of that stillness. It's just the other side of that void that Buddha talked about. Because, again, what's a void? A black, empty, mysterious hole, the black dot at the center of the Mahakalyantara. That portal that's so dark and mysterious to the mind opens to a universe of just brilliant awareness. Dark to the mind, illuminated by consciousness. Dark to their ordinary self, self-luminous, because it's the nature of the infinite to reveal all that is, including what's on this side of the portal. Our awareness, even our awareness in an ordinary sense, is a spark of that boundless awareness. So when we follow the practices, we can go back to source, back to the ground of our being, free of all the things that the mind ordinarily engages in. So we go from having the mind be, so conditioned that it's always chasing after this thing, that problem, this solving, this dilemma, on and on and on, exhausting itself till it finally falls asleep at the end of the day, gets up and does the same thing over and over again. We can leave that entire hamster wheel and discover what's the ground of our being. What's this boundless joy, this rapturous state that mystics of every tradition have spoken about? They're all human beings. They're not aliens. We're human. It's part of our birthright to know this. It's part of our inherent nature to be able to know this. And that's what the yogis and the Buddhas and the great mystics of every tradition have pointed at. Come home. Come home to your true nature. Then you'll discover the boundlessness of that love, that compassion. That's not mind-born, not subject to the limitations of mind. Boundless joy, boundless love, boundless compassion. That's what makes saints saintly. Not because their mind was particularly good at doing that. It's because they've tapped into the source that's beyond the mind. It flows through them. That's the nature of the infinite. So we work with attention, and yes, things are changing in different attentional networks. Things are changing in our autonomic nervous system. Deconditioning processes are affecting how our nervous system, how our mind works. Measures of neuroticism drop as meditators meditate. All these things are going on, but our direct experience of awareness, of attention, is also shifting. Until we get to the point where really, when it gets translated into, for instance, what the great Zen Buddhist master Ryokan, the 18th century, and a great Zen Buddhist, and known for his beautiful poetry, and it reflects the shift in awareness. And sometimes it takes poetry to be able to express that. And so Ryokan writes, "When all thoughts are exhausted, I slip into the woods and gather a pile of shepherd's purse. Like the little stream making its way through the mossy crevices, I too quietly turn clear and transparent." Clear and transparent. Clear and transparent. So the very light of your true nature, the very light of your divine being shines through. That's where these practices are headed. That won't show up in a research study in the New England Journal of Medicine. Clear and transparent. Attention free of the mind. Clear and transparent. Attention simply informed by the boundless awareness of who you are. All our practices are aimed at coming home to that, to living in the truth of that, of walking the truth of that into the world, into our everyday relationships, into our professional lives, into our political systems and economic systems. Everything needs that attention, that highest quality of attention. The highest quality of attention is loving attention. And it's the very ground of your being. The poor mind is relieved of having to effort. How am I going to be loving in this situation when I feel so annoyed? And that's not what this is about. This is that pure, loving, all-encompassing power of what comes through from your very nature and flows right past the mind, clears it of all those impediments. So we bring that into the world. The world is in such desperate need. It needs the fullness of your humanity. The fullness of your humanity, the fullness of your divinity. And these practices are all aimed at allowing us to come home and be rooted in that moment by moment.